Okay, so previously we created the data table. Now we're going to actually do data modeling. In other words, we're going to now create the business objects that we want to model using data modeling in CWAB. Um, so the first thing that you really want to do whenever you do data modeling is to make sure you have some kind of namespace set up. A namespace, think of as say the Java package naming convention. Basically, it's a way to distinguish between the various business objects that you have. So it's important that you come up with some kind of naming convention. So let's do a simple one. We'll just follow the Java package naming convention. So we'll start. First, we'll create a category called data, and underneath there, we'll create our namespace. So we'll say com Kratzilla. You can create any kind of namespace you want as long as it's a way. It will be a sensible way of distinguishing between your various data models. That's all that's really important. Okay, so now we have com Kratzilla, and then we'll create. Let's create a simple order management system, right? So the first data model that we're going to create would be, let's call it order, right? So we'll navigate to the data modeling menu and select data model, and it's going to have the name of the business object. Since it's the order is what we're modeling, so we'll call it order. And then to create, no, that's actually incorrect. We should first create the category to hold the data model, right? So the category is what's called order, not the object itself. So we create a category under the appropriate namespace, call it order, and then under the order category, we're going to create the data model object. And this object should just be called data model, just like in the data table example. It should be called just data model, right? So now we're going to edit this. It's a fairly simple object. So the first one says fields. That's basically pointing to the fields of this model. So we'll leave that as it is. We're going to create that eventually. And the name should be ordered, because that's the name that we'll use in SQL statements. It basically represents the name of this data model object, this business object. And for data table, we need to map it to an existing data table that we created. So we drag and drop the data table that we created previously that we want to associate our business object with, and we do that. Let's say save. And as you can see, it automatically fills in a type identifier. This is basically the unique identifier using the namespace mechanism that we created. You can usually probably should edit this to reflect the actual namespacing that you want to use. I will use data, and then underneath that you come up with some kind of organizational structure. So we'll keep that as it is. So that represents the unique name of our data model, the unique type identifier of our data model. This is important because when you're mapping multiple data models to the same database table, you need a way to differentiate rows in that database table by type. So that's the purpose of that whole type namespacing that I mentioned earlier. So now that we have our data model for orders, we want to add fields. So let's create a category called fields. And under this, let's just create a few fields. We go under our data model menu and create a field. Let's call this, ID. That'll be our first field. And we can clone this so that we don't have to keep going to the menu and say product ID. That is the ID of the product that is being ordered. And we need a field called type. As I said earlier, type is an important All right, we need to recreate that. Let's say product ID. And then we need to clone and create a type. This should always be called Godzilla type. And every data model should have that field. That's how you can distinguish between different data models in the same database table. So now we have our order data model. We need to create a field list, that is an instantiated list, just as we did for data table. So we'll call this fields, and open that up. And we're going to drag and drop all the fields in here. The same process as with for creating data tables. It's very similar. So we have our fields now. We're done modeling the data object, the data model that represents orders. We can actually test this out. So let's create a data statement, because data statements are the ones that use this. So let's say, add order would be the name of the data statement. We open that up. Now, in order to use the data model, you have to drop a reference to it here. And in order to create a reference has to be a list, basically. So it needs to be an instantiated list of data models. You can have any number of data models in your reference list. So let's create a reference list. We open it up. And we're just going to drop our data model in this list. So you can have any number of data models in a reference list. It all depends on what you want to use it for. So now that we have our reference, we've created our data model, we've connected it, we've glued it all together, we can actually try to use it in an SQL statement. So insert into order, that's the object. Order at ID. Order at product ID. And order at Godzilla type. And you do values. Similar idea. Usually the values will probably come from parameters. Since this is a new order, the value will be auto-generated using an ID generator. So Godzilla next insert ID would be one value. The product ID will probably come from the client side. So we'll have product ID, and then the type, we can just open this up here and copy that type. So eventually the idea is the CWAB platform would automate the process of inserting types. That way you, the developer, doesn't have to do it, but for now, it doesn't do that. So we'll do it manually. So we have our insert statement, but to use this model, we need to drop a reference here. That's how we know where to look for it. So now we have this. Check the compile tab. So we're going to hit save, and that should compile the entire model and convert it to actual references to the DCPT table that it's connected to. Hopefully we did everything correctly. So as the technology advances, you won't have to be doing many of the steps that you had to do to set this up. The idea is to create tooling that will automate most of this. Let's see, hopefully this did not crash. So it's possible that we need to bake some things. Let's do a refresh. So that's one of the things. Sometimes, in most cases, you shouldn't have to worry about baking stuff. In a case like this, it is possible that we need to bake some of these CRUDs. Especially, actually, I think we do need to bake the all the columns. They're not baked automatically. That's another thing that we'll probably add in just to automatically bake it. That way, you don't forget to do it. Right, so we baked the columns, and actually we did one thing we didn't do is to connect the fields to the columns themselves, right? So that's another thing that you actually have to do. We define the fields in the data model, but we didn't actually connect them to actual columns. That's an error. That all causes it not to work. So we'll open up each of the fields. All right. So here it says, yeah, we didn't finish. So let's add the name of the field here, and then for each column, we're gonna go to our data table and grab a column of a particular type. For ID, we'll use just varchar. So we'll grab one varchar column and drop it here, and hit save. So we're gonna do the same thing with the product ID field. Again, we didn't complete that. So this is the name of a field, and this is what we would reference in SQL statements. So you need to fill that out. So let's drop another. This is a mapping process now that you're looking at. In other words, we're mapping fields to actual database tables. You do need to check this. Go back to the first one. I don't think we checked it, so that it needs to be evaluated. So as you can see, this is still quite error prone, as I say, because you have to do so many steps to set it up. Again, it's not a terrible problem because it's not something that you're going to spend your days doing, but as the tooling improves, you won't have to be doing too many of these steps. Okay, so we'll give this a name. Again, we map it to a column. Check that. Save. And save. Okay, so let's just double check these fields and make sure it all looks good. Okay, that looks good. Product ID. So that name is still not filled in. Okay, so hit save. And as I said, this is error prone. It's easy to forget to do something, and that would break the workflow. Okay, so that's good. Okay, that looks good. So now we can go back to our data statement and look at the compile tab. Our reference is still there. Okay, so let's try this again. Okay, this is still not cooperating, which means there's still something missing. Let's bake this. Let's bake that as well. Just make sure everything is baked. Usually that's where the problem lies. You forget to bake stuff. Let's bake this. Check the fields list. So here's our problem. We forgot to we put in the wrong. It's not even just the wrong URL. It's not even correctly filled in. So again, this is on our to-do list, is to really improve the tooling here so that you don't run into errors like this. Okay, so we'll try for the third time. Hopefully this is the charm. Voila. So as you can see, this time around, it extracted our parameters correctly. And not just that, it converted our mapping correctly to the fields, to the database table field columns that we're using. So now if you run this data statement, it'll actually insert data into these columns for you, and you can retrieve that data. So in the next exercise, we're going to add some more models and test them and see how they work. Thanks.